Tonight, we're going to wander into a quieter corner of history. Not the battlefields, not the royal councils, but the hidden chambers where whispered secrets and stolen glances shaped the lives of kings and queens. This is the story of mistresses. Some were adored, showered with gifts, their names spoken in hushed reverence. Others lived in the shadows, always one step from scandal, their lives dangling on the fragile thread of favor. As you get comfortable, imagine the flicker of candlelight in a stone chamber, the scent of wax, the creak of wood, the weight of silence. And behind it all, two people, breaking rules, defying expectations, risking everything for love, or perhaps for power. History is rarely tidy, but tonight, let's unravel it slowly, gently, like a whispered secret meant only for you.
The fire in the great hall has burned low. Shadows stretch across stone walls, long and suspicious, like they've overheard something they shouldn't. The queen has retired to her chambers. The servants have slipped away to their straw pallets. Outside, the courtyard lies silent, save for the restless whinny of a horse who knows something is stirring in the night. And there, in the half-darkness of a medieval castle, history's most timeless scandal unfolds. Someone is cheating. Adultery is as old as marriage itself. The vows may have been holy, binding, sealed by God and witnessed by priest and kin, but desire rarely bowed its head politely in church. Behind closed doors, beyond candlelight, whispered across banquets or beneath the canopy of a bed, there lived a shadow world of secret loves. Mistresses, lovers, paramours, whatever name they went by, they were the figures who existed just outside the official record. Not queens or wives, not husbands or knights, but those who turned duty into drama, who tilted the balance of power, who risked ruin for stolen glances and midnight meetings. They remind us that history isn't only parchment decrees and coronations. It's also the warm hand under the table, the ring slipped quietly into a pocket, the risk of footsteps in the hall.
In medieval Europe, marriage wasn't usually about love. It was about property, land, alliances, heirs, and duty. A nobleman might marry a woman because her father owned fertile fields. A merchant might wed for dowry or trade connections. A king might take a queen because she brought him an army. But lust? Lust didn't read contracts. Lust arrived uninvited, laughing at family negotiations, kicking over carefully planned dynasties like a stray dog knocking over a bucket. And that's where mistresses entered. They filled the gap between arranged duty and actual desire. Picture it: a king, married to a politically convenient but distant queen, finds himself enchanted by a lady of the court. Or a bored knight, bound to his marriage in a nearby village, sneaks away after vespers to meet a widow with kind eyes and a warm hearth. These weren't unusual scandals. They were everywhere. What made them fascinating is that sometimes they stayed secret, and sometimes they blew entire kingdoms apart. Make no mistake, cheating was dangerous. For commoners, the risks were brutal. Public shame, whipping, sometimes even exile. A wife caught with another man could be dragged through the streets or branded. A husband, if too careless, might face his rival's blade. For nobles, the rules were slipperier. Wealth and power provided a kind of protection, and sometimes society even expected a nobleman to have mistresses. But even at the highest level, discovery could lead to scandal, political fallout, or worse, because adultery wasn't just a matter of love, it was a matter of inheritance. If a queen bore a child, everyone needed to believe that child was the king's. Adultery threatened not just feelings, but entire dynasties, which meant that when discovered, it was never just personal. It was dangerous.
Picture yourself in a castle, late at night. The torches are guttering low. Somewhere in the distance, a monk mutters his midnight prayers. You slip out of your chamber, heart racing. Each step echoes too loudly against the flagstones. Ahead, a shadow moves. Is it your lover, waiting? Or is it a servant, a guard, a spy in the wrong place at the wrong time? In that frozen moment, you feel the thrill and terror of every mistress and secret affair in history. Desire pulling you forward, fear clawing you back, and the knowledge that discovery could mean ruin. The Church's watchful eye. In the Middle Ages, few things terrified people more than sin. And adultery? That was one of the big ones. Priests thundered about it from pulpits. Confession manuals written for weary parish priests listed adultery in painstaking detail alongside the proper punishments. Some of these punishments sound like a medieval workout routine. For a fling with another man's wife, you might be told to fast on bread and water every Friday for a year, or walk barefoot to a shrine dozens of miles away. Sometimes both. But the real weight wasn't just penance, it was shame. Entire villages might know. Whispers at the well, smirks at the market, cold shoulders in church. In a world where reputation was survival, to be branded an adulterer was to carry a scar that no priest's absolution could quite erase. Still, the risk never stopped people, because rules, even holy ones, tend to crumble in the heat of human desire.
Folklore and warnings. Medieval storytellers loved a good tale about cheating. Many of them read like early soap operas, equal parts scandal and warning. In fabliaux, those cheeky, often obscene French tales, wives tricked husbands, husbands tricked wives, and clever clerics somehow always ended up in the wrong bed. The moral was usually, don't cheat because you'll be caught. But the popularity of these stories suggests another truth. Everyone enjoyed laughing about it. Superstition layered on top of story. Adulterers were said to suffer strange punishments, impotence, madness, or being cursed with children who resembled the wrong parent just a little too much. In villages, suspicious gossip sometimes turned to accusations of sorcery, because what else could explain why someone strayed, if not witchcraft or a love charm? And yet, for every warning, there were whispers of success. Couples who carried on their secret affairs for years without being caught. Letters passed through trusted servants. Trysts in barns, orchards, cloisters. The danger was half the thrill. The language of secrecy. Adultery invented its own codes. You couldn't just walk up to someone's wife and say, "Meet me in the hayloft after supper." You needed signals. A dropped glove, a particular flower in the hair, a verse of poetry that to most ears sounded innocent, but to one meant everything. Courtly love poetry, especially in aristocratic circles, doubled as a coded diary of desire. A knight writing about his lady might very well be writing about someone else's wife. The metaphors of falcons, hunting, and gardens weren't just literary flourishes. They were masks, hiding dangerous confessions in plain sight. Imagine the tension, reading a love poem at a banquet, while the husband of the lady sat right there, nodding politely, not realizing the poet was describing his wife's eyes. That's not just poetry. That's performance art on the edge of ruin.
The peasants' affair. Of course, not all affairs took place in castles or courts. Among peasants, adultery happened too, but it was messier, riskier, and punished with less mercy. A farmer's wife sneaking out to meet a neighbor might be caught by her own children, who blurted it out in church the next morning. A miller's tryst could be discovered when he left flour on his boots. A shepherd caught with someone else's wife might be publicly whipped or fined. But even in the fields, temptation lingered. Long days of labor, crowded cottages, arranged marriages. People wanted escape, excitement, tenderness. A barn, a festival, or even a stolen moment on a feast day offered just enough opportunity for desire to slip past duty. For peasants, though, the fallout was heavier. Nobles might smooth over scandals with wealth. Peasants had nothing but their fragile reputations. And once ruined, those were almost impossible to repair. Picture this: a small stone church, dim with incense smoke. You kneel in the confessional, heart pounding. The priest listens as you stumble through your sin. "Father, forgive me, for I have loved another who is not mine to love." There's silence. Then the weary sigh of a priest who has heard this exact confession 100 times before. He prescribes fasting, prayers, maybe a pilgrimage, but as you leave, clutching your penance, you know something he doesn't. You'll sin again. Maybe tonight, maybe tomorrow. Because what drives you forward isn't reason or rule, it's that same dangerous spark that has haunted history forever. Forbidden love.
Queens versus mistresses. Who really held power? The banquet hall glitters with torchlight. The queen sits at the king's side, jeweled, composed, her smile practiced like the Latin of a prayer she's recited 1,000 times. On the other side of the room sits another woman, less adorned, but drawing glances all the same. She isn't a queen, but she's the reason courtiers lean closer, whispering behind goblets. She's the king's mistress. Here, in this fragile dance of dignity and scandal, lies one of history's strangest rivalries: queens versus mistresses. One had the crown, the ceremony, the public duty. The other had the king's ear in private, his laughter and stolen moments, and sometimes far more influence than any coronation could grant. The queen, duty in a crown. Queenship was work. It meant heirs, alliances, appearances, diplomacy. A queen's body wasn't her own. It belonged to the dynasty. Her womb was a political vault. Her every movement scrutinized by clerics, servants, ambassadors. Some queens found ways to carve out influence. They ran courts, wrote letters, acted as regents. Others faded into the background, overshadowed by louder voices at court.
And then there were those who had to sit, day after day, watching their husbands parade affection for another woman. For a queen, to complain too loudly was to risk looking weak. To ignore it was to seem complicit. To fight back was to risk scandal. Her power lay in walking that razor-thin line, maintaining dignity in the face of humiliation.
The mistress. Influence in the shadows. Mistresses had no crown, no official seat, but what they had was proximity, the private laugh, the whispered conversation in bed, the ability to suggest something while the king was relaxed and vulnerable. It might sound trivial, but in politics, timing is everything. A well-placed word from a mistress could sway a decision, ruin a rival, promote a friend. Entire careers rose and fell because of pillow talk. Some mistresses became almost semi-official, running households, receiving gifts, holding audiences. Others were kept more quietly, known only by a few courtiers, but still dangerous in their subtle influence. The risk? They had no legal protection. If the king grew bored or politics demanded it, they could be dismissed, abandoned, or worse. A queen might survive scandal with her crown intact. A mistress lived entirely at the mercy of her lover's favor. When queens and mistresses collided. Sometimes queens tolerated mistresses. Sometimes they ignored them. And sometimes they fought. There are stories of queens publicly humiliating mistresses, sending them away, even having them banished from court. There are also stories of queens forced to share banquets, ceremonies, even living spaces with women who were openly sleeping with their husbands. The court, meanwhile, fed on the tension. Servants gossiped, nobles picked sides, poets and chroniclers scribbled down barbed little verses about who held the king's heart, and by extension, who held the kingdom's fate.
Imagine a royal feast. On one side of the king, the queen, regal, stiff, her smile fixed like plaster. On the other, the mistress, radiant, laughing, leaning just a little too close. The courtiers glanced nervously between them. Who should they flatter? Who should they sit beside? Who will still be in favor tomorrow? Every gesture, a hand on the king's arm, a shared joke, a toast, carries political weight. The queen wears the crown, but tonight the mistress commands the room. When mistresses shaped history, it wasn't always petty rivalry. Some mistresses genuinely changed the course of kingdoms. They advised kings on wars, treaties, taxes. They placed friends and relatives into positions of power. They became patrons of art, literature, even architecture. A mistress could be more dangerous than any general. After all, a general had to win battles. A mistress only had to win the king's heart and keep it. Agnes Sorel, the first official mistress. The year is 1444. Charles VII of France, worn down by the endless 100 Years' War, is a gloomy figure, insecure, indecisive, almost beaten. Enter Agnes Sorel. She was young, beautiful, with a sharp wit,
And unlike most mistresses before her, she wasn't hidden in shadows. Charles adored her so much he elevated her openly at court. Agnes received titles, estates, jewels, even appearing beside the queen in ceremonies, an audacity that shocked Europe. But Agnes wasn't just decoration. Chroniclers claim she revived Charles's spirit, giving him confidence to lead, to push back against English forces. She urged him toward decisive victories. The mistress wasn't just sharing his bed, she was shaping the fate of France. The Queen, Marie of Anjou, endured it silently. Duty bound her, her dignity trapped inside courtly smiles. She represented tradition. Agnes embodied modern power, influence born not of lineage, but of intimacy. Alice Perrers, from Goldsmith's Daughter to Shadow Queen. Across the Channel in England, the court of Edward III saw a similar story. His mistress, Alice Perrers, began as a servant in Queen Philippa's household. By the 1360s, she had replaced Philippa as Edward's closest companion. Alice became infamous. She wore the Queen's own gowns, sat beside Edward in council, and was said to manipulate court cases in her favor. Nobles despised her, calling her greedy and vulgar, but her power was undeniable. When Queen Philippa died, Alice's influence soared. It was whispered that she, not the aging Edward, was the real force behind royal decisions. The nobles struck back. After Edward's death, Parliament condemned her, stripping her of wealth and banishing her. But the fact remains, for years, a king's mistress effectively ruled England.
Diane de Poitiers, mistress turned icon. Fast forward to the 16th century, and France again produced a legendary mistress, Diane de Poitiers, lover of King Henry II. Unlike the fleeting affairs of most monarchs, Diane's influence spanned decades. She was nearly 20 years older than Henry, but their bond was unshakable. While Queen Catherine de' Medici bore children and fulfilled dynastic duties, Diane controlled Henry's affections and much of the court. She was given palaces, titles, and the crown jewels themselves. Artists painted her as a goddess. Henry signed documents with her advice in mind. For courtiers seeking favor, it wasn't the queen they approached, it was Diane. Catherine loathed her. When Henry died, Catherine wasted no time reclaiming power. She banished Diane, seized her estates, and stripped her of jewels. Yet Diane's shadow lingered. For much of Henry's reign, she had been, in practice, the true queen. The Two Queens Dilemma. Stories like these weren't rare. In court after court, Europe wrestled with the same strange imbalance: the queen with legitimacy and the mistress with intimacy. Courtiers lived in constant calculation. Do you flatter the crowned queen, risking her cold dismissal? Or do you cozy up to the mistress, hoping her whispers to the king advance your fortunes? Sometimes queens and mistresses reached quiet arrangements, living in uneasy balance. Other times, the rivalry burned white hot.
Picture a nobleman at the French court. He has a petition, a request for land.
Should he present it to Queen Catherine, dignified and sharp, or slip it into the hands of Diane, radiant in pearls, her laughter ringing through the hall? One wrong move could cost him everything. Align with the queen, and you risk angering the king's favorite. Align with the mistress, and if she falls tomorrow, you'll fall with her. In a world of fragile favors, the throne wasn't just about crowns, it was about beds. Mistresses beyond romance. Not all mistresses were motivated by love. Many played the game with clear-eyed calculation. For them, intimacy was a route to survival, to wealth, to shaping the world. Some became patrons of art. Diane de Poitiers funding architecture. Madame de Pompadour championing Enlightenment writers. Others acted as brokers, arranging marriages, pushing treaties, influencing religious policy. Their reach could be vast, but also perilous. Queens had dynasties behind them. Mistresses had nothing but a king's affection, which could vanish with age, boredom, or political pressure.
The silent queens. And what of the queens themselves? Their silence shouldn't be mistaken for weakness. Many endured, playing the long game. Some outlived their rivals, waiting patiently until the king's passion faded or death leveled the field. Others used subtle weapons, icy distance, political alliances, church backing to undermine the mistress's influence without ever raising their voice. For the queen, survival meant swallowing pride, because her duty was not to herself, but to dynasty. And in the chronicles of history, that quiet endurance can feel as tragic as it is powerful. The Forbidden City, where love was scheduled. Step into Beijing's Forbidden City, heart of the Ming and Qing dynasties. Here, mistresses weren't whispered scandals. They were a system. The emperor had dozens, sometimes hundreds of concubines, ranked in strict hierarchies. At night, court officials would present the emperor with carved ivory tags, each inscribed with a concubine's name. The emperor would flip through like a man choosing a book, and whichever tag he selected was sent to his chambers. The chosen woman would be bathed, perfumed, and carried on a blanket so no ill omens from the ground could touch her feet. But while it sounds like indulgence, it was deadly serious. A concubine's survival and her family's fortune depended on producing a son. One child could elevate her clan into power. Another's failure could see her forgotten in gilded isolation. The empress officially reigned over this harem, but in practice, jealousy, alliances, and sabotage festered. Behind silk curtains, whispers of betrayal and quiet poisons decided which woman's child might one day inherit the dragon throne.
The Ottoman harem, behind the veil of power. Move westward to the Ottoman Empire, where the Topkapi Palace harem housed hundreds of women. Outsiders imagined orgies of pleasure, but the truth was far stranger. The harem was a political machine. At its center was the Valide Sultan, the Sultan's mother, who often held more power than any minister. Below her, concubines vied for attention, but the stakes were more than affection. It was life or death. A concubine who bore the Sultan a son might see him rise to rule. But Ottoman succession was brutal. Brothers often killed each other to claim the throne,
which meant a mother's survival depended entirely on whether her child won the deadly lottery of empire. Consider Hurrem Sultan, once a slave girl from Ruthenia, who became Suleiman the Magnificent's favorite. She shattered tradition by becoming his legal wife, advising him in statecraft and reshaping imperial politics. In whispers, she was either the scheming witch who led Suleiman astray or the genius who gave the empire stability. Mistress, wife, strategist, her story shows how thin the line could be between scandal and sovereignty. The Mughal courtesans, power in silk and song. In India, under the Mughal Empire, mistresses and courtesans carried yet another face of influence. These women were not just companions, but artists, poets, dancers, and in many ways, cultural icons. They were trained in literature, music, and politics, skilled in conversation as much as seduction. A Mughal emperor or nobleman's affair with a courtesan wasn't only about desire, it was about prestige. To be seen with a courtesan of refinement was a mark of taste and sophistication. Yet, behind their celebrated performances, these women lived precarious lives. Wealth and fame could be theirs for a time, but when patrons shifted or died, many fell into obscurity or poverty. Unlike queens, they had no dynasties to shield them, only their talents and their fleeting moment at the center of attention.
A whisper in the shadows. Picture a dimly lit chamber in Topkapi Palace. A concubine leans close to a visiting court official. She doesn't ask directly, but her smile and her carefully chosen words make the request plain. "Remember my son when the council gathers." The official nods. He knows her position is fragile, but he also knows she has the Sultan's ear, at least tonight, and that could mean favors tomorrow. Here, intimacy was never just about hearts. It was a form of currency, as potent as gold. Love and scandal beyond palaces. Not all stories were gilded. In village markets, temples, or small-town inns, affairs and secret loves also reshaped lives. In medieval Japan, for instance, samurai lords sometimes kept concubines, but so did traveling monks and poets. Scandals could spark blood feuds or inspire whispered verses. In the Islamic Golden Age, tales of forbidden love and betrayal found their way into poetry, where the mistress was not just flesh, but metaphor, a symbol of temptation, of human weakness, of the dangerous pull between duty and desire.
Expanding the map of infidelity. Across cultures, one pattern repeats. Where there is power, mistresses often lurk in its orbit. But the roles vary wildly, from secret companions hidden in fear to public icons who reshaped empires. The scandal of Europe's courts was a system in China, an empire within an empire in the Ottomans, and an art form in Mughal India. Each one shows us not only how universal betrayal is, but how endlessly inventive humans are at weaving love, power, and danger together. The perks that weren't always perks. At first glance, Being a mistress looks enviable. Fine clothes, private chambers, the best food on the table, sometimes even jewels slip discreetly into your palm for your loyalty. But privileges came with strings. Your dresses were gifts that reminded you they weren't really yours. Your rooms were never secure. One word from your lover's wife or one shift in his mood, and you could be stripped of everything overnight. Imagine standing in silk slippers, admiring the glittering hall of a palace, while knowing that every brick beneath you rests on the shaky foundation of someone else's vows. The weight of secrecy. To be a mistress meant living a half life. You couldn't boast about your love, no matter how passionate. You couldn't introduce yourself proudly as someone's partner. You were a whisper, a rumor, a face glimpsed from a carriage. In some cases, your children were quietly provided for, but never acknowledged. In others, they were erased, their future stolen because their parents' love was deemed illegitimate.
Jealousy's ghost. Mistresses did not exist in a vacuum. They always haunted someone else's story and someone else's bed. For queens and wives, the existence of mistresses was both insults and threat. Some tolerated them with gritted teeth, treating them as unfortunate accessories to powerful men. Others lashed out with fury, orchestrating dismissals, exiles, or worse. And between mistresses themselves, rivalry simmered. A king or noble could keep many, but affection was not evenly distributed. Whisper campaigns, poisoned rumors, subtle gifts to servants in exchange for secrets. This was the silent battlefield of the boudoir. The mistress who became invisible. Think of the countless nameless women whose stories never made it into chronicles. The peasant girl whose lord slipped into the barn at night. The innkeeper's daughter courted by a traveling friar. The maid in a castle who was kept until her youth faded and then dismissed, replaced by someone younger. Their names aren't gilded in history, but their lives were marked by fleeting moments of power, followed by silence. A velvet dress one season, rags the next. The strange cruelty of being both desired and disposable. A room without locks. Picture a chamber lit by a single candle. A woman waits. The sound of footsteps approaches. But is it her lover? A servant? Or the wife storming in at last? She straightens her dress, breath caught in her throat. The candle flickers. The door creaks. The thrill of love is always accompanied by the dread of discovery. That dread is what makes the flame burn so hot and what ensures it can scorch at any moment.
When love becomes work. For many mistresses, love blurred into labor. You weren't just a secret, you were an entertainer, a confidant, a political ally, a mirror for a man's ego. Some women leaned into this, mastering the role, turning their influence into something close to real power. Others were consumed by it, drained by the demands, trapped in a relationship they could not escape. The constant calculation, how to smile, when to speak, how to flatter without overstepping, was a performance that never ended. And unlike queens,
Mistresses had no crown to protect them. Their power was always borrowed, always provisional. The toll of time. And then there was the inevitable, age. A mistress might rise to dazzling prominence in her youth, her beauty celebrated, her influence unrivaled. But years pass, faces fade, and powerful men often turned their gaze elsewhere. Some were fortunate enough to secure titles, lands, or marriages to maintain their status. Others were quietly discarded, left to retreat into convents, cottages, or obscurity. History often remembers them at their peak, dazzling, dangerous, adored, but few stories linger on what happened after the candles went out. The fragile humanity beneath the scandal. Beneath all the drama, mistresses were human beings trying to survive within rigid systems of power. They loved, they feared, they calculated, they hurt. And that's perhaps the greatest cost of all, to be remembered not for who you were, but only for the scandal of whom you loved. The rise of the royal favorite. Every court had whispers, but some mistresses were more than whispers. They were royal favorites, wielding influence that could rival ministers. Take Diane de Poitiers, mistress of King Henry II of France. She wasn't just a lover. She was his advisor, his style icon, his shadow queen. For decades, Diane dictated French court fashion, arranged political alliances, and secured vast wealth for herself and her family. When Henry signed royal decrees, Diane's handwriting often annotated them, as if she had dipped her pen directly into the bloodstream of power. And yet, her story shows the volatility of such power. When Henry died in a jousting accident, Diane's influence evaporated overnight. Catherine de' Medici, Henry's long-suffering queen, wasted no time banishing Diane from court, reclaiming the jewels and castles that had been given to her. One moment a monarch's muse, the next a political exile. Barbara Villiers, mistress as political weapon. Across the Channel, in the court of Charles II of England, Barbara Villiers, Countess of Castlemaine, wielded her beauty and wit like weapons. She bore several of Charles's illegitimate children, but more importantly, she extracted influence, land, and titles from the king with uncanny skill. Barbara used her role to shape factions at court, rewarding allies, punishing enemies, and ensuring her relatives prospered. She was described as greedy, imperious, scandalous, yet she was also untouchable for much of Charles's reign. Her presence created headaches for Parliament, furious that so much of the kingdom's fortune was being siphoned into the hands of a mistress. But Charles, ever indulgent, brushed them off. "She is my Lady Castlemaine," he said, as if that alone justified the kingdom's expenses. For Barbara, the line between passion and politics had dissolved. She wasn't just stealing kisses, she was redistributing power. The architect of empire, Madame de Pompadour. Perhaps no mistress embodied political power better than Madame de Pompadour,
the celebrated companion of King Louis XV of France. She wasn't born noble, yet she rose through charm, intellect, and meticulous planning. Once inside the king's orbit, she refused to be only a lover. She became his confidant, his cultural curator, his unofficial minister. Pompadour sponsored philosophers like Voltaire, patronized artists, and helped orchestrate France's participation in the 7 Years' War. Her influence extended into diplomacy, architecture, and even the decor of Versailles itself. She is credited with popularizing the Rococo style, which became synonymous with 18th century France. Remarkably, when her physical relationship with the king waned, her power did not. She pivoted seamlessly into the role of his advisor, ensuring her position in court life remained unshaken. In a world where most mistresses faded with age, Pompadour became proof that influence could outlive desire.
The ink-stained hand. Imagine a candlelit chamber at Versailles. The king sits slouched in his chair, weary from council meetings. Beside him, Pompadour dips her quill into ink, sliding papers across the desk. "Sign here, sire," she murmurs, her voice soft but assured. He barely glances at the document before scrawling his name. Outside, ministers mutter that policy is being drafted not in the council chamber, but in the bedroom. But Pompadour knows better. Power is not where it's supposed to be. Power is wherever the ink dries. Catherine the Great, from mistress to monarch. And then there are stories where the mistress herself became the ultimate power. Consider Catherine the Great of Russia. Before she was empress, she was the young wife of Grand Duke Peter, trapped in a loveless, politically hostile marriage. She took lovers, yes, but more importantly, she built alliances through them. Her charm and cunning drew powerful nobles into her orbit. When the moment came to depose Peter, it was Catherine's lovers, along with loyal guards and statesmen she had courted, who orchestrated the coup. She transformed from vulnerable consort to autocrat, ruling Russia for decades. Here, the mistress was no longer accessory or scandal. She was the architect of an empire.
The mistress as muse. Not all wielded raw political power. Some changed history through art. Take Alice Parers, mistress of Edward III of England. She became the target of scorn, accused of manipulating the aging king for wealth. Chroniclers despised her, describing her as ravenous and avaricious. Yet she also inspired poetry, plays, and cautionary tales that shaped English views of power and corruption for generations. Mistresses were often painted as villains, temptresses leading kings astray, symbols of decadence and decay. But in those caricatures, they left an imprint on culture as enduring as any queens. The double-edged sword of influence. What unites these women is not romance, but leverage. They turned intimacy into opportunity, seizing roles denied to them by birth or law. Some rose to dazzling heights, reshaping kingdoms, arts, and politics. Others fell swiftly, their fortunes crumbling the moment their patron died. In either case, their power was undeniable and deeply unsettling to the societies around them. Because if a mistress could sway a king, then where, really, did sovereignty reside? The cultural double standards of infidelity. If there's one truth that cuts across the centuries,
It's this: cheating has never been judged equally. The rules for men and women weren't just different, they were written on entirely separate scrolls. In medieval Europe, for example, the Church officially condemned adultery as a sin for both sexes, but in practice, a married man having a mistress was seen as a lapse in morality, while a married woman having a lover was seen as a crime against the entire social order. Why? Because female fidelity was directly tied to inheritance. If a wife had an affair, there was the dreadful possibility of introducing a child that wasn't the husband's into the family line. That meant confusion over heirs, land, and power. In other words, chaos. Meanwhile, kings and nobles could openly keep mistresses, and often did. Some even flaunted them. The women, however, were forced into a delicate balance, existing as both a celebrated beauty and a whispered scandal. But these double standards weren't exclusive to Europe. In Confucian China, men could take concubines freely, while women were bound to strict chastity. In Japan's Edo period, courtesans were considered artists and cultural icons, yet married women faced intense pressure to remain faithful. Across the Islamic empires, polygyny was permitted, but female infidelity could lead to severe punishment. And yet, through all of this, mistresses weren't simply passive figures. They learned to maneuver through these double standards, shaping their survival through charm, intelligence, and influence. When mistresses became patrons of culture, the French court is perhaps the most dazzling example. Mistresses of the king often turned their positions into cultural powerhouses. Madame de Pompadour, mistress of Louis XV, wasn't just a lover, she was a patron of the arts, funding painters, playwrights, and architects. She helped shape the Rococo style that defined an era. In her salons, philosophers like Voltaire found a space to speak. In Italy, during the Renaissance, mistresses often doubled as muses. Powerful families like the Medicis sponsored artists whose inspiration came from these secret romances. Sometimes, the face of a mistress appeared in paintings under the guise of a saint, a goddess, or a biblical figure. They were hidden in plain sight, immortalized in frescoes and canvases. In some ways, being a mistress offered more agency than being a wife. Wives were bound to duty and politics. Mistresses could wield influence without the suffocating weight of official roles. This made them dangerous figures to some and beloved allies to others. The economics of desire. We can't forget that affairs weren't just about passion, they were often about money. Maintaining a mistress was expensive. Gifts of jewels, estates, or entire apartments in Paris became the norm. A nobleman's reputation might depend on his ability to keep a mistress in style. But women, too, calculated carefully. Some sought lovers not just for love, but for security. A wealthy protector could mean survival in a world where female independence was nearly impossible. Others sought status, moving up the social ladder through romantic entanglements that doubled as political gambits. Cheating, in this sense, was rarely simple. It wasn't always about sneaking kisses in dark corners. It was tied into power, art, survival, money, and empire. Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, and then Mark Antony. Let's start with perhaps the most famous triangle in all of antiquity. Cleopatra VII of Egypt wasn't merely a mistress, she was a political force. Her relationship with Julius Caesar cemented her grip on Egypt's throne. But when Caesar was assassinated, she shifted her allegiance to Mark Antony. Their love affair was passionate, public, and, fatally, political. To Rome, Cleopatra wasn't just a foreign queen. She was the dangerous mistress who had bewitched Antony. The scandal was weaponized by Octavian, later Augustus, who painted Antony as a man corrupted by lust and luxury. The result? The Battle of Actium, Antony and Cleopatra's downfall, and Egypt's absorption into the Roman Empire. An affair had literally redrawn the map of the Mediterranean.
King Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. Fast forward to Tudor England. Henry VIII's obsession with Anne Boleyn wasn't just a scandal. It tore England away from the Catholic Church. Anne wasn't his first mistress, but she was the first who refused to be just a mistress. She wanted marriage, a crown, and legitimacy. Henry's determination to have her led to the annulment of his first marriage to Catherine of Aragon, the excommunication of England, and the founding of the Church of England. What began as a king's affair escalated into the English Reformation, changing the religious landscape of Europe forever. Catherine the Great and her lovers. Russia, too, had its share of thunderous affairs. Catherine the Great's name is often surrounded by scandalous gossip, many of which are myths, but the reality is intriguing enough. Catherine had numerous lovers throughout her reign, some of whom she elevated to positions of great power. Her relationship with Grigory Potemkin was legendary, a partnership of passion and politics. Potemkin helped her expand and modernize the Russian Empire, showing how a love affair could become a strategic alliance. Of course, detractors painted her as promiscuous to undermine her reign, but Catherine wielded her lovers like tools of statecraft.
Louis XIV and his endless mistresses. The Sun King of France, Louis XIV, practically turned infidelity into a political system. He had a parade of mistresses, both official and unofficial, each wielding influence at court. The most famous was Madame de Montespan, who became embroiled in the infamous affair of the poisons, a scandal where accusations of black magic, love potions, and even human sacrifice swirled through Versailles. Though she was never officially convicted, the very idea that the king's mistress might have been dabbling in witchcraft rocked the French court. It revealed the dangerous cocktail of love, superstition, and politics that mistresses often embodied. Napoleon and Josephine. Even Napoleon Bonaparte, conqueror of Europe, wasn't immune to scandal. His marriage to Josephine was passionate but rocky, marred by infidelity on both sides. Napoleon's affairs became legendary, But Josephine herself was rumored to have cheated on him during his early campaigns. These betrayals weren't just personal. They influenced Napoleon's political decisions. His eventual divorce from Josephine, though heartbreaking, was also a calculated move to secure an heir and strengthen alliances. In the end, their romance symbolized the collision of love, power, and empire.
Mistresses as spies, secrets, and silent weapons. If you thought mistresses were only figures of luxury and scandal, think again. In many courts, they weren't just companions of the powerful, they were the eyes and ears of entire empires. Where pillow talk happened, secrets slipped, and those who listened knew how to use them. The pillow as a weapon. A king might not confide in his counsel, but in the warmth of midnight he whispered to his mistress. Those whispers, half-drunk confessions, plans, frustrations, were worth more than gold. Mistresses became walking archives of state secrets. Some chose silence, others didn't. In 17th century France, Cardinal Richelieu was infamous for recruiting mistresses as informants. Lovers of nobles and officers suddenly found themselves courted by spies, pressured into passing along military secrets. A mistress could topple a general without ever lifting a sword, just by repeating what he muttered after wine.
Courtesans as double agents. Venice, in the Renaissance, was famous for its courtesans, women who were not only skilled in seduction, but also highly educated. They spoke multiple languages, entertained ambassadors, and gathered whispers like pearls. The Venetian Republic was known for using these women as unofficial intelligence agents, weaving politics with desire. It was a dangerous game. A courtesan who gave too much away risked her life. One who held back risked irrelevance. Their power lay in that delicate balance, desirable enough to be trusted, clever enough to survive. When love letters became evidence, affairs left a paper trail, and in espionage, letters could be as deadly as daggers. Kings and mistresses wrote endlessly to one another, not realizing how dangerous their words could be if intercepted. Take the infamous case of Mary, Queen of Scots. While not a mistress herself in the conventional sense, her alleged love affair with the Earl of Bothwell became entangled with her downfall. Letters, real or forged, were used as evidence of her guilt in the murder of her husband. Passion became prosecution. Love became treason.
The unseen influence. Mistresses didn't just gather secrets. They influenced decisions quietly, invisibly. A monarch's mistress could whisper a name in his ear, and suddenly a man was promoted, exiled, or executed. No official seal, no decree. Just the suggestion carried on a sigh in bed. The danger was obvious. Enemies at court hated mistresses not only for their intimacy, but for their influence. Some mistresses played carefully, treading the line between affection and manipulation. Others pressed too far and fell into ruin.
Conclusion. Love, power,
and the shadow of the mistress. So, what have we really learned wandering through the candlelit halls of history's great affairs? That mistresses were never just background characters. They were ornaments and outcasts, scapegoats and strategists, lovers and liabilities all at once. They stitched themselves into the fabric of politics, war, art, and scandal. Some rose to near queenly heights, showered with jewels, titles, and influence. Others fell just as quickly, exiled or executed when desire cooled or rival struck. In their presence, kings became reckless, revolutions sparked, alliances shifted, and in their absence, the world still whispered about them. Because mistresses were more than flesh and romance, they were symbols of temptation, of danger, of possibility. What makes the history of mistresses so endlessly fascinating isn't just the gossip. It's that they reveal the rawest truth about human power, that desire and politics are never separate, that love, lust, and loyalty can shape empires as surely as armies. And maybe, just maybe, it shows us something uncomfortably familiar. No matter how gilded the palace, no matter how mighty the crown, the heart is still the one thing rulers could never quite keep under control.